that kind of randomness for Hashcash as a stamp, that wasn't actually convenient. That was a side effect. And I put some effort into seeing if one could reduce that variance. But for Bitcoin, the randomness is important because it's a global race to find the next set of Bitcoins. And you don't want the person with the fastest, most overclocked single computer to always win the race.
Hello, welcome to episode 59 of the Bitcoin Game. I'm Rob Mitchell. I'm happy to bring to you part one of my interview with Cypherpunk Dr. Adam Back. Dr. Back talks about topics such as his first computers, his early privacy-oriented work, Hashcash, various early electronic money systems, and much, much more. Get ready to soak in some history from someone whose work became an integral part of Bitcoin. Pun intended. Please check out the show notes page to help you find links to topics mentioned in this episode. And there are a lot. Just go to thebitcoingame.com and look for episode 59. Now here's Dr. Adam Back.
Hello.
Thanks so much for coming on the Bitcoin Game.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me.
Great to be speaking with you. And just so you know, my background, I'm a pretty mainstream person. I grew up in a liberal environment in Los Angeles, and I became interested in Bitcoin in early 2013. I'm not really technical, though I've always been interested in technology. And, I feel like I have kind of Bitcoin maximalist leanings. I also don't feel intelligent or informed enough to really have confidence in those feelings. So I like to, hear all sides, and I never feel really sure about how much to trust my leanings, just so you know who you're talking to.
Well, that's a good way to approach things anyway, right? Look for information, don't prejudge things, or what have you.
Well, it's pretty hard in this space. I feel like I'm really at a handicap not being super technical. I feel a little shy to weigh in too much on anything, but...
It's a wide field with a lot of different inputs, right? So some of it is probably like economic trade-off or an economic argument sometimes.
I believe so too. I just, I don't have a huge background studying economics either. It's mostly just, being someone around your age. I'm actually a little older than you, and having lived life and invested a little, and I guess just how I've soaked stuff in that way rather than reading a ton and taking classes.
Yep.
So, can I ask where you are right now?
I am in Malta in Europe.
And what's it like there?
It's like a small island, 450,000 population, and it's like a Mediterranean kind of thing. It's pretty warm generally.
It's kind of a friendly place to crypto, is that right?
Well, it has become so lately. So in the last couple of years, they have taken steps to introduce some forward-thinking crypto-friendly regulations for all kinds of crypto activities. And it's kind of a pattern for Malta because it's within Europe, but it has some elements of offshore company management and things like that. So they have taken a similar kind of approach with forward-looking regulations for offshore gambling for other European countries, so operation of internet gaming services. And after the 2008 financial issues, they introduced some hedge fund related regulation to attract hedge funds to the island. So they also have a attractive corporate tax regime, so somewhat similar to Ireland's, the country Ireland. So yeah, that's the general approach to be early and reasonably well-respected regulatory environment with good certainty for businesses.
I'm just really curious about people like yourself who've done so much, what your youth was like, what interests you had, maybe some of your early memories that maybe led you on your path.
So I guess I got interested in computers fairly early and had a ZX81 and then a Sinclair Spectrum. So I think some of those are sold in the US as a Timex brand, and it's basically a Z80 based computer with 1 kilobyte of base RAM, the ZX81, and 16 kilobytes of expansion RAM, I guess that's right, yeah. And the Spectrum was more powerful, a little bit faster of a Z80, and 16 kilobytes of base RAM and 64 kilobytes of in total if you extended it. Yeah, so it was interesting to learn programming on those things. I was generally interested in physics and math, and so I found programming an interesting activity and taught myself Z80 programming from a reference manual. And I didn't have an assembler or disassembler because it didn't come with one. And so I wrote one in BASIC, which was the only kind of native toolkit that came with it. So that made it easier to disassemble programs and look at what they were doing, like the programs in the ROM.
Can I ask how old you were when you were doing this stuff?
I think about 12 or 13.
Wow, okay. Pretty young, especially for then, it seems like. Was it just purely some internal drive, or did you have some outside influences that had you doing all this stuff?
No, I just found it interesting, sort of from a mathematical and sort of the fact that you can do some pretty interesting things with this machine, right? So mathematics is kind of more abstract, but here you could write a program to calculate something or achieve some effect. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And so when it came time for college choices, so college in the UK is 16 to 18, there wasn't actually a computer science option available. So I did physics and maths, but they had some computers in a computer lab. So I taught myself Pascal programming on those, and then did computer science at university, undergrad, bachelor of science, and then a PhD. So I kind of got the bug, as it were.
Did you feel a little more advanced than most of your peers?
Well, it's interesting going to university because at that time, so this was in 1989, the students coming in, some of them had not really done anything on a computer before. They just had the entry qualifications of, I think, typically reasonable academic achievement in math and physics was the entry requirements. So there's really a mixture. Some people were pretty interested in programming and had capability in a few languages, and others were starting from scratch. So yeah, I guess the first year was kind of easy to people who had a good foundation in math and in programming, because they also brought people up to speed in math, as in the first year only, some math classes, because not everybody was at the same math level either as an entry requirement.
So you continued and you got a doctorate?
Yeah.
What was that in?
Computer science in distributed systems, basically programming algorithms and programming for distributed systems. So systems with many CPUs, sometimes connected by fast interconnects or by remote interconnects, and trying to parallelize software to run on them. So I actually heard about the Byzantine generals problem from back then, coincidentally, and read a number of papers about other distributed system algorithms. So during my PhD, I got interested in cryptography, which was kind of mostly unrelated to the PhD topic. But a friend of mine who's doing a master's degree was also working on these distributed systems. We had some parallel computers with lots of CPUs on a fast interconnect, and his master's project was to speed up RSA encryption and decryption using all these cores and slow interconnect. I mean, the interconnect would be slow compared to shared memory on multi-core computer. So I took a bit of interest in understanding what he was doing, and then a bit after that, PGP was released, and people were talking about that on the internet. And so I knew what it was on a technical basis and found it pretty interesting, sort of sociologically, so the implications for the balance of power between individuals and the establishment. I mean, already the internet had aspects of that, but this was that on steroids.
Did you have experiences or anything that kind of had you interested in the sociological effects and the man versus individuals kind of like?
Not specifically in a technological sense, but I mean, I think I grew up around people who were fairly independent-minded and tried to form their own opinions and wouldn't just take, what you might hear on the equivalent of Fox News as an accurate representation of the world at large. So, I did have some sort of influences to think for yourself and, question things and form your own judgments. So I found particularly the fact that writing software could have a positive social impact and potentially address some imbalances in the world as interesting and something that I could maybe do something with. So I think the Cypherpunks list had just started up sometime around then, or I became aware of it and joined that. And so that was an interesting outlet because people were then working on other things other than PGP, so other things you could build with encryption and cryptography. So I spent a good part of my PhD actually not working on distributed systems, but learning about all kinds of cryptography protocols, mainly with with an applied interest to think about what a given protocol or cryptography paper could enable you to build. So I implemented a couple of different things around then. I implemented a library for David Chaum's electronic cash system and Stefan Brand's electronic cash system, which is a slightly more flexible, efficient electronic cash system that's vaguely related to Chaum's electronic cash system, which is really the first that added strong privacy guarantees. And also implemented something called Eternity, which was supposed to be a kind of censor-resistant way to publish information built on top of Usenet News, which had some kind of gateway protocol. So Usenet is broadcast. So the idea is there would be thousands of machines that would have locally stored copies after it's distributed of the messages that people would post on it. And if you encoded it correctly, it could be decoded and read as a web page, for example. So I built some software actually written in Perl to encrypt and post and then decrypt and render with a local proxy. So the idea is it would be hard to censor information published on it. So it's kind of a peer-to-peer sort of broadcast system, but using an underlying system for delivery.
So were you independently thinking of writing code kind of to help people before you discovered the cypherpunk movement?
I did talk to some people about PGP before that, got involved with talking with technical journalists about PGP and how it worked and why that was interesting. And so the Cypherpunks was interesting because there was sort of a number of similar-minded people and some additional application areas that could be built. So one of the things that somebody else built was a remailer, so a way to provide privacy for email. And so the sender wouldn't be visible to the recipient. And in some cases, there were sort of pseudonymous replyable versions of it that were a bit more complicated. And how Finney implemented the integrated PGP into a remailer to make it more private. The original version wasn't encrypted, so if somebody was watching the email traffic and it's sort of passive recording of internet traffic, they would have been able to see who was sending to who. But with the introduction of PGP encryption into it, and it could be kind of nested onion encryption via email, it would provide more privacy. And actually, so I ran a remailer for some years after that. And there was no way to charge for it, right? Because it's kind of a volunteer thing and there was no private way to make payments. So people were interested in electronic cash as a way to fund these kind of services, to make them into services that would pay for themselves. And as people use them, they would pay small, like per message fees, and that would add up to enough to operate a server. And if there's a lot of demand, you could add more servers or more bandwidth. But there wasn't a deployed electronic cash system. So anyway, I was happy to run this remailer as a kind of volunteer activity. But one of the downsides was that people would spam through it, particularly to Usenet. And the spam wasn't topical, like it was just random numbers, basically. And I think what we, like other people who were looking at this issue, were thinking was happening was that the people were doing it were trying to annoy the operators of Usenet by sending a lot of spam through it, because then the complaints would come back to the remailers. So I think it was a kind of anti-privacy, politically motivated DOS attack, denial of service attack. So I got to thinking, well, what could one do about this? Now, at the time, and still today, a lot of anti-spam systems are based on identifying the sender. And to my way of thinking, this was misthinking the problem, because email should be private, and the basic email protocol is not actually authenticated in any way, because there's no generic way to authenticate an email sender. And because it was connected to a remailer, there was definitely no way to for people to use their normal technique of blocking the sender, because by design you don't know who the sender is. So it got me to thinking about it in a different way, which is like, well, what's the underlying problem? The blocking people based on identity is not really a solution. It's just a patch, and it doesn't work that well. People just create, people who want to determine to spam for commercial reasons just create lots of email accounts, and there's essentially no cost to creating an email account. So the real underlying problem is it's free. There's no cost to sending. And so that's where I came up with Hashcash, which is a way to add a cost to sending. So the sender could, let's say, run their computer for a couple of minutes and create, I guess, about 5 leading zeros in hex or 20 leading zeros in binary of collisions on the beginning of a stamp by grinding on their computer for a few minutes. And they could attach that to their email as a kind of electronic postage stamp, and the recipient would be able to verify it. So one nice thing about this particular way to use Hashcash is it's quite scalable, because the stamps include information about the purpose of the stamp, and what I put into the purpose field was the recipient's email address. So the recipient would know that the stamp was specific to them, so they could keep a local spent stamp file and reject attempts to reuse stamps by putting an expiry field on the stamp of about a month. They could delete old data. And so that meant that it would scale basically indefinitely, because if everybody in the world used that, it would still scale fine, because there's no kind of shared infrastructure. There's no peer-to-peer network. There's no coordination or central servers or anything. So it was perfectly scalable, which was kind of attractive to somebody who was interested in distributed systems and cryptography. Anyway, so that was a way to create a cost. And so people were talking about that on a Cypherpunk list and other places afterwards, to think about that it felt a bit like digital gold, but they weren't sure how to control inflation. So people were brainstorming about different ways to do that and to potentially make it respendable. So Hashcash was written about. I just posted some information on a mailing list and some source code in 97.
Was it just a good idea, or was it actually ever used by anyone?
So yes and no. So the kind of downside is you have a bootstrapping problem, right? So unless everybody is checking the stamps, it won't have as much effect. So one neat way out of that kind of bootstrap problem is Spam Assassin added Hashcash as a negative score. So Spam Assassin is used by a lot of ISPs and people that run their own mail servers to sort of mark messages that are suspected to be spam or store them in a separate folder for the users. And it works on a scoring system. So if it sees things about the message content that looks spammy via different heuristics, it just keeps adding up the this is probably spam score. and it has a bunch of different filters. And if the spam score is really high, then it's probably going to get stuck in a folder, and you'd have to dig it out to find it. And so what they did is to add a big negative score if there was a valid Hashcash stamp on a message, and that way it sort of satisfied its purpose, without a lot of individuals having to have plugins to understand the stamps, right? As a sender, the advantage would be your email will be far less likely to be wrongly put in a spam folder, which is a utility in itself, right? Because it's not uncommon that people would get their email incorrectly categorized. So also Microsoft made a similar system. So basically it was format incompatible, but otherwise the same concept. And they called that Postmark and integrated it into the Microsoft suite of email things, like I think Hotmail and Outlook server and the Outlook client. And they also kind of opened the specification so you can find it online. Unfortunately, it wasn't interoperable, so there were two silos of anti-spam protection. And people also used it for other things. So I mentioned the pseudonymous remailers, where you could pick a pseudonym and send emails pseudonymously and receive responses to that. And some of the people that were operating those noticed that, so this is another kind of remailer-related denial of service issue, they noticed that people would name squat, so they would kind of create lots of accounts and take all of the more attractive, more concise names that people would want, kind of like domain name squatting, right? And so they added a feature to require the person that wanted to create a pseudonym or reserve the name to create a bigger Hashcash stamp, one that might take an hour or something. So they figured that would slow people down who were just trying to take all common words or something to be a nuisance, or because they figured they could maybe sell them to people later or something. So there are a few ideas like that. I mean, that one got implemented, and there were other ideas about sort of more interactive uses where if a web server would be overloaded, it could start charging, not reusably charging, but demand the sender provider stamp so that it would degrade gracefully under nuisance denial of service, because if it was completely under denial of service, essentially no regular user would be able to use a web server. But if the cost of requesting a web page increased, from negligible to a second to 10 seconds of compute, it's better that the web page loads slowly than not at all. And that escalation in cost would slow down the denial of service as well, because people doing the denial of service would then start to need lots of CPU to keep it up. So there was an RFC on that, but I don't think like an internet protocol draft, but I'm not sure that got implemented in a wide way.
Too bad. I wonder if that could have helped things.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a reasonable thing to do. There's a related protocol called Syn Cookies by Dan Bernstein, which is not using cost, but it's so one of the kinds of denial of service attack is that TCP stacks tended to have a limited number of connection slots, and so there's a three-way handshake when you set up TCP connection for like a web server, a mail server, or something, and the first part of the handshake is like a message, and that takes up a connection slot, and then the connection slot sits there until there's a response, like an ACK message that comes back. So some clever person figured out that you could just send lots of SYN messages to the server. That's create the connection slots, and you exhaust its connection slots, and then the server wouldn't be able to take any more connections, even though it's completely idle. So it's kind of very amplified denial of service. Somebody with not much bandwidth or equipment could take down a big server or prevent it taking connections. So Bernstein's proposal was that instead of having a connection slot, you send in your response, you send information to the client containing what would have gone in the connection slot, but have it be authenticated by the server. So it's like, that's why he calls it a cookie. So one of the ideas was to extend that so that it would also start to require work or cost to make a connection. Anyway, it's a related concept, but without the work, because he had similar arguments about graceful degradation for clients that didn't support cookies. They would be blocked, they wouldn't be able to get in, but people who had upgraded and had support for it would be able to get in, and that was better than nobody be able to get in.
And one final question regarding Hashcash. There was a earlier 1992 paper, Pricing via Processing or Combating Junk Mail, that I assume you're familiar with. And I know sometimes people go, Adam Back, he's kind of like the guy behind proof of work. And then people say, well, no, these other people are. Can you explain the differences or
Yep.
I really have no clue.
Sure, yeah. So actually at the time I came up with Hashcash, I wasn't aware of this paper, but some months later, somebody sent me the reference. So I read that paper, and the concept is similar in terms of having a cost to create a proof that can be quickly verified, but the mechanisms they used were different. They were using public key cryptography, so things like Schnorr signatures or Fiat-Shamir transform and square root in a field. And so basically what they'd done is taken public key cryptography signature schemes. There were 3 different schemes in the paper. So normally with a signature scheme, you should be able to verify a signature, but if you want to break it, it should be inordinately expensive, like basically infeasible with today's hardware to take decades to break a key or something. And so what their approach was to reduce the key size until it became feasible to break the signature, and then they would force you to break it to prove that you've done some work. And so it's a kind of more complicated way to achieve the same effect, and it has a lot of disadvantages. So you need to create work of different sizes, you need different keys, and you have to generate them. The proofs are bigger, tend to be slower to verify, and particularly at Bitcoin's size of proof of work, the keys would be enormous, so it would become a nuisance. Like the proofs would be enormous, like maybe megabytes or something. So and the other kind of difference is that Hashcash is a Poisson process, so it's kind of like a random process where it's equivalent to throwing lots of coins until they all land with the tails up. And so there's an expected time in Bitcoin. That's every 10 minutes you will expect this many tails, but the actual time can be can vary a lot. It can be faster, it can be slower, and that kind of randomness, for Hashcash as a stamp, that wasn't actually convenient. That was a side effect, and I put some effort into seeing if one could reduce that variance. But for Bitcoin, the randomness is important because it's a global race to find the next set of Bitcoins, and you don't want the person with the fastest, most overclocked single computer to always win the race. You want, somebody who has 1% of the hash rate to get 1% of the coins, and somebody who has 2% of the hash rate to get 2% of the coins. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair, and it would be, it would ruin the incentives for mining, basically. So it's an interesting question whether you could have used those proofs of work for Bitcoin. It seems like, at least for 2 of their proof of works, no. One of them maybe, but the proofs would have been big, and it may be that there is a pre-computation attack against it. So that there is one which has some randomness in finding a square root. The mathematical approach to finding the square root in this field is to pick a random number and iterate until something happens, and that has some randomness, but it's not clear if the random properties are the optimal solution and if it's a perfect Poisson distribution and so on. So it's at least Hashcash is a more elegant, simpler, faster, more compact. So it has a lot of advantages.
A quick message from our sponsor. BTC Inc. is excited to announce its upcoming conference, Distributed Health, November 5th and 6th in Nashville, Tennessee. This is the first conference to bridge the gap between blockchain technology and the healthcare industry. Now in its third year, this two-day event is an opportunity for all members of the ecosystem, including payers, providers, lawmakers, retailers, investors, and innovators to reshape the future of healthcare. For more information, visit health.distributed.com and use the promo code BTCGame20 to secure a 20% discount. The Bitcoin Game is also sponsored by BTCKeychain.com, probably the most well-known Bitcoin keychains in the world. Get your own, just go to BTCKeychain.com. When I interviewed Peter Todd, he mentioned that he had forgotten, and someone brought it to his attention just, I think, a few weeks before the interview, a few years ago, that he had actually communicated with you about Wade-Eye's B-Money, and I guess you also talked to Hal Finney. Do you have a lot of memory about that time?
Sure. I remember, a lot of, I tend to have a good memory for technical topics. I will remember those super clearly. And actually, the conversation with Peter Todd is kind of curious because it was a long time ago. He was pretty young at the time, like 13 or 14 or something. And I think I was about the age that he is now, maybe, or something at the time, or maybe a bit younger. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of interest in trying to, the observation that Hashcash was a bit like digital gold. There were people that made that observation, I think, within a couple of days, but people trying to figure out a way to make that into a respendable electronic money. So both Wade-Eye's B-Money and Nick Szabo's BitGold proposed about the same time. We're trying to achieve that same effect, so trying to make respendable money. And they were both contemplating that the way you would create the money is by mining it using Hashcash. So there were a lot of ongoing conversations about, related topics, how to build such a thing, what properties it should have. And so there were a lot of interesting conversations between, like 97 and 2002, on and off, on the cypherpunks and cryptography lists where people try to figure out different ways to do things. And Peter Todd was involved in some of those discussions. And I'd kind of forgotten his name. So more recently, I knew Peter Todd through Bitcoin technical forums, but hadn't put two and two together that he was involved in those early discussions. So in 2004, Hal Finney made another system for respendable Hashcash, basically, which he called RPOW, reusable proof of work. And his approach was to not make a distributed peer-to-peer system, but to make a centralized system, but do so using a TPM, so a piece of hardware that basically comes on like a PCI card, and it's a whole computer on a card, and it's tamper resistant, so it's covered in epoxy, so you can't physically tamper with it easily, and you can install software in it, and it will provide you with a signature that you can send to somebody over the network, which asserts that this is the software that's running inside this tamper-resistant hardware. So you can sort of trust it insofar as you trust the person operating it not to have been able to tamper with it without, resetting the keys, and that the manufacturer who certifies the TPM keys is also somewhat trustworthy to not certify keys that are running in software. And with that proviso, you could, he had it operating for a while, and you could do some work with Hashcash and send it to the server, and it would exchange it for a CHORM electronic cash token. And then when you spent the CHORM electronic cash token, you send it to somebody else, and they could exchange it with his server again. And you could be guaranteed that no coins would be created without valid work being provided, or without being swapped for a previous coin. So that was also cool, but centralized. And there's a similar kind of fate that happened to David Chaum's company DigiCash. They had the same. Actually, it's the same protocol that Hal Finney used. This centralized electronic cash protocol with extremely good privacy properties. So DigiCash had implemented that and was, working on commercial adoption, typically with financial partner, so that they would be able to, people would be able to deposit money and receive coins and then claim the coins back afterwards. And in the meantime, spend the coins in an electronic cash-like way, user to user, but mediated by the server. Because to spend, you basically have to, the recipient needs to go to the server and swap the coin for a fresh one to prevent double spending. So DigiCash had set up a demo server, and they said they would keep it running, for the long term, and they would only issue 1 million of the beta bucks. So people thought that that was interesting enough. They would give you beta bucks by emailing, send you a few. So people on the Cypherpunks list had a go at bootstrapping, a floating value for that coin, which was centralized. And I sold a couple of T-shirts. I had made some T-shirts with a compact implementation of RSA, which was kind of a novelty and also technically illegal to export from the US at the time in electronic form because of some export controls on cryptographic encryption software. So people figured that with a few thousand people trading things, one could arrive at a price, but then the server went offline because DigiCash went bankrupt. And that happened, I guess, in the mid-90s before Hashcash and a lot of the other things we talked about. But I think people saw it as a lesson in the risks of centralized systems, and that's, I'm thinking, partly why Weidai and Nick Szabo talked about more decentralized architectures in the B-Money and Bitgold.
So, are we getting close to Bitcoin here, or do you have anything else before we get to Bitcoin?
No, I'd say that, after RPAL, the next sort of development, I'm sure there were some academic publications because those are ongoing and people are incrementally improving electronic cash protocols and so on. But Bitcoin was the next and obviously by far most practical and live system that came after RPAL and B-Money, Bitgold and Hashcash and Chaum and Brands. Actually you saw that Hal Finney was one of the first people to try out Bitcoin. He was somebody that would like to download software and try it out and gain an understanding by sort of playing with it and experimenting with it. So he wrote up a report about, his experiences from using it and how it worked to explain to other people on the cryptography list what it does. And that started some early discussions about Bitcoin. I noticed that, from my perspective, the immediate problem that occurred to me was the limited amount of privacy that it had, because you could track coins as they're spent, basically. There's a little bit of ambiguity due to there being coins and amounts are paid out of multiple coins, and it's not clear who the owners of coins are. You can have payments with multiple parties paying in. So the kind of weak privacy struck me as an issue because the previous centralized electronic cash systems had extremely strong privacy. So, in some cases, privacy in the same kind of sense that digital signature would be extremely hard to break, the privacy would be extremely hard to break. Some of them were actually, in principle, unconditionally private. So even a computer in the very far future wouldn't be able to disambiguate coins. And so it's kind of a surprising result, but yeah, some of the protocols could do that. So Bitcoin was kind of, it had some privacy, but not much by previous eCash protocol standards. And the other thing that I saw people talking about was scalability questions, because it's a broadcast system, how well would that scale? Would the information and bandwidth usage grow and the storages grow and that kind of thing. So I guess it took a while for the adoption to grow for that to be a problem. And also the people working on the Bitcoin protocol implementation, like the main Bitcoin reference implementation, spent many years super optimizing everything, like the network protocols and the cryptography, so they use less CPU and the memory usage patterns and the complexity of lots of different sub-algorithms. So they were able to extend the period where there would be scalability problems by quite several years, I would think. So I think ultimately broadcast systems are difficult to scale, and you do want the ability to verify as a power user or as a concerned individual or as a business that you can verify the double spend database. Otherwise, you're essentially trusting other people. And we know what trusting other people looks like, because that was the status quo, where third parties can cheat you or close your account or freeze your account, or that kind of side effect like you see with PayPal and banks and things. So the sort of public auditability overhead is a consideration.
Am I right in thinking that due to some of the limitations you saw with the privacy and scaling, you maybe didn't jump onto the Bitcoin bandwagon for a little bit?
Yeah, so I was, I guess, busy doing other things. So I was working on some interesting large-scale storage system for a company with many petabytes of cloud storage, and there's some interesting technical challenges in there. And I thought it was obviously pretty interesting that somebody had made a live system, and was basically thinking, well, that's an interesting experiment. Let's see if it bootstraps this time, because the DigiCash Chorm system kind of started to bootstrap a little bit, and then the central server got switched off when that company filed for bankruptcy. So I was interested to see, if it would bootstrap, and it took a few years, before there were exchanges and an appreciable price, but it did get there. I think a lot of people sat up when it, they reached $1 or $10 or $100, or prices where they had assumed it may not reach, or that if it did reach, that felt like a kind of milestone, right? So I set to thinking about ways that Bitcoin could be improved, mostly about privacy, actually, and started engaging on the Bitcoin Talk forum and IRC and things like that, and most actively in 2013 onwards. So one of the things I found that was more practical, and practicality can relate to implementation details, right? So if you're modifying a system, the change ideally should fit within its framework. So even if it's conceptually possible, if it doesn't easily fit in a framework, or it has its own scaling problems, that can be a barrier to seeing it be used. So one of the things I came up with is confidential transactions, which is a way to encrypt the values of a transaction. It doesn't change the public ledger traceability of coins and where they're spent to, but it hides the values. So if Bitcoin had at some point confidential transactions implemented in it, you wouldn't be able to, in a block explorer, see how much money's moving around. You just see coins moving around with the amount being encrypted. And from a cryptography perspective, it's not so hard to hide the values and have them still add up. So you need to be able to verify that they add up, because the chain has to be auditable So users need to know that when somebody spent a coin, they didn't add something to its balance, right? So there's a form of encryption or masking that can protect that, but it has the problem that people can encrypt values. They can encrypt negative numbers, basically. So you have to prevent that, and that makes the confidential transactions bigger than they would otherwise be. You can think about it like, if you had one Bitcoin and you sent two outputs from the transaction, one of which was 101 Bitcoins and one of which was minus 100 Bitcoins. That still adds up to one. So you could say it adds up, and then you could never spend that negative one because nobody would accept it because it's, negative 100 is invalid. And then you could spend 101, which would include inflation, and that would basically be the end of the system because people would have infinite wallets and it would lose all scarcity. So you need a solution to that, and it turns out there's a way to do that with something called a range proof. So I tried to optimize a range proof that I was aware of from some of the other electronic cash protocols. It's kind of an obscure citation in Stefan Brand's thesis paper. So a later time, like a couple of years later, Greg Maxwell picked it up and improved the protocol. So found a way to make them a bit smaller, reduced it from like 3 kilobytes of proof to 2.5, I think. And there's been subsequent work to improve that since then. And that has been implemented on Elements and Liquid, which are sidechains to Bitcoin.
I hope you enjoyed part 1 of my interview with Dr. Adam Back. Please come back and check out the second half of my interview in episode 60 of The Bitcoin Game. If you want to say hello, I'm the BTC Game on Twitter, or you can leave a comment on this episode's show notes page at thebitcoingame.com. See you next time.
The following audio does not meet minimum requirements.
Oh, sit right back and hear a tale of Dr. Adam Back. He'll tell you of his early days leading up to electronic cash. Names like Shaman, Stefan Brand will come up as so many more. We even hear of another proof of work that sometimes you lie schnorr. It's sometimes you lie schnorr.
This was a mistake.
And this is just the first of 2 episodes with Adam Back. So let the first one start right now in a Cypherpunk retrofact attack. In a Cypherpunk retrofact attack. In a Cypherpunk retrofact attack.